whatever happens in this war, the problem of Russia will persist. Integrating Russia into the world economy, into the global structures, was a very big ask. There was this fantasy that somehow by developing economic relationships with Russia, we could somehow democratize it or encourage democracy to flourish there. And there was this kind of ideal that developed, particularly since the 1990s, that suggested that wars on the European continent were a thing of the past. They're not supposed to happen in Europe anymore. Wars can happen in Syria or Libya or Afghanistan, but not in Europe. And very much when you look at geopolitics, the whole geopolitical calculations that were made, it all assumed that peace was more or less the default position in Europe. The European Union got the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012. The assumption was that all the bad days had gone behind us. And as a result, we took our eyes off what was going on in Russia, in Ukraine, and the whole Balkan area, and the whole Baltic area, not realizing that there were conflicts that were just simmering away and dying to explode and come out.
Well, what was the alternative, I guess, Frank? Because that whole end of history argument, which was that the world was proceeding happily to a liberal democracy everywhere and there'd be nothing to talk about in the future, has clearly died a horrible death. No one believes that now. But what was the alternative way of handling Russia in that period? Because you have to have some degree of optimism, don't you? That people don't tend to go to wars with countries they trade with. The idea of joining together as part of a global economy had some sound thinking behind it, presumably.
I think there were two options. One was to take Gorbachev at his word. Gorbachev, when he was in power, wanted to be part of a European homeland, and I think that it could have been possible to be more sensitive to Russia's insecurities, to their security concerns, and somehow try to draw Russia in much more into Europe, maybe even think about making Russia, if not quite a member of NATO, but somehow linked to NATO. That was one option. But the other option was to take geopolitics a little bit more seriously, to try to work ways and means to ensure that, for example, Ukraine's security concerns were taken much more seriously. You have to remember when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, the West just more or less stood by with essentially performative sanctions and their hands folded. So nothing was done to indicate to Russia that there's a very clear red line there, and you must not cross that without major retaliation. And therefore, Putin imagined that when he invaded again, pretty much the same kind of reaction would occur. So in a sense, there were two options, either by trying to be nice to Russia as much as possible, bring them into the Western world, which could have been done about 20, 25 years ago possibly, or the other alternative was to be extremely clear about the geopolitical interests that we had and the conflicts, potential conflicts that would erupt very, very soon.
Do you worry, do people say to you, Frank Furedi, that even the title of your book in some way diminishes the responsibility of Vladimir Putin in all of this, that ultimately this is an act of warmongering from someone trying to solidify his own personal wealth, his own personal position, and his own view of Russian and Soviet history. And ultimately, when a person like that is in the seat of power, there's very little that can be done by the West. The fault, such as it is, falls upon him.
Well, the fault obviously falls upon him, and I make that very, very clear. And in fact, the reason why I wrote the book was because I feel emotionally and kind of culturally and philosophically attached to the cause of Ukraine. I met a lot of refugees when I went to Ukraine. I spent a bit of time on the border between Hungary and Ukraine. I got really drawn into the conflict, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. But at the same time, as being unambiguous in my condemnation of Russia and holding them entirely responsible for the invasion, there's also a larger picture. And the question that concerns me is, have you learned the lessons of the last 100 years? How are we going to deal with the Russia question? Because whatever happens in this war, the problem of Russia will persist. I mean, in all kinds of ways. For example, should Russia have a major setback in this war, then the very integrity of the Russian Federation is called into question. And what happens when the Caucasian bits of Russia begin to get disentangled and Iran and Turkey begin to pile in? We have to think of all these scenarios which are no less real than what's going on in the Ukraine at the moment.